In this video, we'll discuss the risk register as a useful tool in step 5 of our generic risk management model. Here is our 5-step generic risk management model presented for review. At this point, problem identification, risk estimation, risk evaluation, and risk control tasks have all been completed, and the risk manager is focusing on the risk monitoring task. This includes the steps of monitoring, evaluation, and iterating the process as necessary. The risk register is presented in step 5 because it is a particularly useful tool for risk monitoring. However, as we go through this video, you'll learn that the risk register is also in times an effective risk management planning tool, so it could have been introduced at other steps as well. The risk register is a risk management tool that is growing in popularity. Because it's designed for use throughout the life of a project or an activity, it's a very practical monitoring tool as well. I'd like to add a word on terminology here to avoid the redundancy and the verbosity of saying project or activity and naming all the things to which a risk register could be applied. I will, for the most part, just talk about applying the risk register to a project, but please understand that that would apply to any kind of activity or use of the risk register tool. The risk register serves as a central repository for the organization's risk information and allows for the information that results from the risk management process to be suitably sorted, standardized, and merged for relevance to the appropriate level of management. The risk register is the log in which you record the details of all the risks identified at the beginning of a project or activity and throughout the entire life cycle of that project. The risk register is an effective tool for assessing risk, for evaluating risk, and for monitoring risks throughout the life cycle of a project. It is because of its value as a monitoring tool that we're presenting it here at this point in the class. But please understand that smaller projects may use the risk register as the actual risk management plan. In other words, preparing, implementing, and monitoring a risk register is very often an appropriate risk management plan in lieu of the more elaborate sorts of solutions that you've seen in the aquatic nuisance species and the Vibrio parahemolyticus and oyster case studies that we've looked at. Sometimes the risk management plan is far more simple. Let's consider some of the reasons why you would use a risk register, and we'll begin by considering the risk register and the risk identification task. The risk register is a useful tool for identifying risks before a project begins. It helps an organization understand the nature of the risks that they're facing. It would help the members of the organization become aware of the extent of those risks as well. You'll see when we look at a video demonstration of the use of a risk register and when we examine a couple examples of this, that the risk register can be quite comprehensive in terms of the range of risks that it identifies. Continuing the notion of why one would use a risk register, let's consider the risk register and the risk evaluation step. The risk register identifies both the level of risk that the organization's management is willing to accept and the level of risk that the organization itself is willing to accept. So the risk register is very helpful when we get to that task of deciding whether an identified risk is acceptable or unacceptable. When a risk is identified as unacceptable, the register identifies the risk the team is willing to tolerate, as well as the ways the teams will manage risks that are not acceptable. Let's consider risk register and risk control as part of this discussion about why one would use a risk register. The risk register assists an organization in recognizing its ability to control and reduce risk. Done well, it documents all the risk mitigation strategies that are being pursued in response to the risks that are identified in the register. The risk register will identify mitigation actions that are required for implementation of the risk management plan. And that would be true whether the risk register is a small part of a larger plan or if the risk register represents the risk management plan. The register provides a useful tool for managing and reducing risks identified both before and during the conduct of the project. In this video, our primary focus is on the use of a risk register as a risk monitoring tool. So let's consider why you might use a risk register for this function. First, and perhaps most importantly, it provides a documented framework from which the risk status of the project can be reported at any point in time. Thus, when the risk register is initially prepared before the activity or project is begun, the risk register serves as a forecast of those risks that are of greatest concern. As the project proceeds, the risk register is maintained and updated, and so the risk register becomes a record of how certain risks are resolved and how new risks may be evolving. With the risk register, management has in place early warning factors for risk events, and these can trigger upward reporting thresholds that inform risk managers and staff about when to notify higher authority in the vertical team. The risk register ensures the communication of risk management issues to key stakeholders by identifying those risks of greatest concern and those who would have the greatest interest in those risks. The risk register provides a very handy risk communication aid. It also provides a mechanism for seeking and acting on feedback to encourage the involvement of key stakeholders in the risk management activity. We're talking about the fifth step in the risk management model, so it's important to ask, when would it be appropriate to prepare a risk register? The initial risks must be identified and assessed very early in the project life. So the presumption would be that if the risk register is going to be used as part of a risk management plan, as opposed to simply a risk monitoring tool, the risk register would be prepared very early in the risk management process, as early as step 1. So keep in mind the different uses for a risk register. The risk register can be used to inform risk management options. That would be to prepare it early in the process and to use it as a tool to help risk managers formulate plans that would achieve objectives and avoid constraints. The risk register could serve as the risk management plan in its entirety. It may well be the plan, or the risk register can be used to monitor an ongoing risk management activity. And that's the sense in which we primarily present it in this video. In a separate video, I'll walk you through an example of a risk register. Among the course materials, you find links to other resources that illustrate how other folks have used risk registers. So one thing that you should understand is there's no such thing as the risk register. A risk register is a fluid, flexible, and useful concept, but most risk registers usually include such things as a unique identifier for each risk of concern to the risk managers. There would be a description of the risk and how it could affect the project. There is an assessment of the likelihood and the consequence of each risk, and that assessment is used to produce a rating or a ranking for each risk. At that point, the risk register focuses more intently on the risk management tasks, and it identifies who is responsible for managing the risk. It would likely identify a proposed risk mitigation action, and it will sometimes identify the resources that are required for this mitigation. There's no requirement that you restrict the risk register to these, and you'll see examples before we finish this week. The risk register is intended to be a living, breathing, dynamic document. It is born at the beginning of a project, and it would follow the project all the way through its life cycle. So the details of the risk register are fluid. They have to be maintained throughout the project life cycle. It's important that the register be coordinated with the vertical team. Decision makers in any organization may be several levels above the risk analysis team in the organization's hierarchy. It's important that anyone who have any responsibility for risk management, whether it be in allocating resources or in taking specific actions, be coordinated with, familiar with, and bought into the risk register. The register's entries are going to change regularly as uncertainty is reduced, or sometimes as it increases as you move through a project. In addition, the effectiveness of your mitigation strategies will be revealed through the life of the project, and it will be at times necessary to alter or tweak those strategies. And that's the very point of the monitoring purpose of the risk register. Access to the risk register should be controlled in order to maintain its integrity and its confidentiality.